Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Delmar Chabad Center, and today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Bruce Lorence. He's a PhD candidate at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem in Judaic Studies. Welcome to the show, Mr. Lorence.
Thank you.
The first thing I'd like to ask, of course, is we're interested in Jewish studies on the Jewish View, of course, and just your specific expertise that you're learning about in Jewish history. Surely there's such a big spectrum in Jewish studies.
Well, that's right, Rabbi Simon. There is an enormous spectrum, but my area of specialization is Sefardic Studies, and I am now a PhD candidate in early modern Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Jerusalem, the capital city of the State of Israel. And it might be of some interest to your viewers that nearly 25 years ago, I first came to the Capital District as a freshman at the State University of New York at Albany, and I was in the class of 1970. I'm a graduate of that year. And my year was the first incoming freshman class to go to the then new campus of the State University of New York at Albany.
So you have your roots in Albany. So this is a long time ago. What were you doing up till then now?
Well, before that, actually, I lived in Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up. As a matter of fact, I lived on Eastern Parkway, not too far from the world headquarters of the Chabad movement.
Very good. Just something rubbed off on you. Something good. Okay.
Right.
So now with your, so you've been learning at the Hebrew University. This is in Israel, as we said, in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Specifically on a PhD program.
Yes, and previously I had done an MA at the Hebrew University at the Institute of Contemporary Jewry there. But in that case, I was specializing more in Holocaust studies. In total, I lived for some 20-odd years in Israel. During that entire time, I was in the city of Jerusalem.
So you picked up a lot of Jewish studies in Israel. It's the best place, I guess, to learn it if you're going to go and learn about Jewish history.
Absolutely.
So specifically, you tell me your history is going back to the early modern era of Jewish subjects. Fill us in on what you're specifically geared towards.
Well, actually, I'm working on the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, which is basically the period that is called early modern history, and specifically Jewish history in this period. And even more specifically, my doctoral studies relate to the Portuguese Inquisition in the 17th century. The topic of my PhD dissertation is a group biography of new Christians or forced converts on trial before the regional tribunals of the Portuguese Inquisition in Coimbra and Évora in the first half of the 17th century. I should explain, that's a very long title, but actually Coimbra and Évora were important towns in Portugal. Coimbra in the center of Portugal, it was, and still is till this very day, the university city of Portugal, and Évora as well was a university town in the south of Portugal.
Well, let's back up. Everybody, well, hopefully, I shouldn't say everybody, but it's more known about the Spanish Inquisition, that
Right.
the Jewish people had a flourishing community in the early part of this 1300s, 1400s, and the 1492, and we'll get into it a little later, about it's very coincidental, quote unquote, if we can say that 1492, when we're going to be celebrating Columbus's discovery of America, was
Right.
the same year. It's a special date in Jewish history, was the state of the Spanish Inquisition. So that's more of a known idea that the Jewish people were forced to either convert to Christianity or to move out. But really, Portugal, I don't know if most people know about it. If they know something about Spain, they didn't know about Portugal. So tell us a little bit about how the Portugal Inquisition came about. Was it after Spain or beforehand or consequential with it?
Well, actually, if I can put it this way, the Spanish Inquisition was the pioneer Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula. I'm talking about a national inquisition and not a papal inquisition. There was a papal inquisition earlier in Aragon, in the Kingdom of Aragon. But when we're talking about national inquisitions, the Spanish and Portuguese national inquisition, the first one was in Spain, and it was established in 1481. And in 1483, the famous Grand Inquisitor was appointed, Thomas de Torquemada. And only in 1539 was the Portuguese Inquisition finally established by King John III of Portugal. As a matter of fact, I can very briefly show you here. I have a picture of him. Let's see, he's here. You can see him right here. Yeah. Yeah, he was a very, very, I would say, fanatic Catholic, and he was determined to root out all non-Catholic heresies, so to speak, such as the Judaizing of the new Christians in Portugal. But let's go back just for 1 minute back to Spain, and I'd like to explain how all of this came about, just very briefly. Basically, if you may recall, at the end of the 14th century, namely in 1391, there were mass riots against the Spanish Jewish community, against all the communities in what is now Spain, let's put it that way. And however, these riots did not, fortunately, pass on to Portugal, and I think that is to the credit of the Portuguese royal house that they didn't at that time, to King John I of Portugal. But from that time, what we have in Spain were two separate communities. We had a community of Shlomei Emunei Yisrael, in other words, those Jews that were always Jews and continued on to perform the mitzvot. And there were those who became officially Catholics, but secretly practiced Judaizing. These were crypto-Jews. And so you had these two communities living one side by side, one being the New Christian community and the other being the Jewish community. Now, this situation continued on for a full 100 years until in 1492, namely on March 31st, 1492, the Jews of the new kingdom, United Kingdom of Spain, were expelled. What I mean by united, in other words, when the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, united their separate thrones of Aragon and Castile and established una grey, una espada. In other words, one flock under one sword, or one religion and one kingdom. And that's exactly what they wanted. And once they were able to remove the last Muslim kingdom, namely the Kingdom of Granada in the south of Spain, all it remained, once they conquered that kingdom, all that remained was to remove the Jews by expelling them from Spanish soil. Now, the problem is that the minute that they could do that, then these Jews could then flee across the border into Portugal. And that is exactly what happened. Between 1492 and 1497, some 75,000 Spanish Jews fled across the border into Portugal and thereby escaped the Spanish Inquisition. So the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, were very interested that King Manuel I, who was then King of Portugal, would establish a Inquisition there as well. And this was made as a condition for his marrying their daughter Juana at this time. so that in 1497, or to be more precise, at the very end, in December of 1496, King Manuel I of Portugal issued an edict for the expulsion of the Jews from Portugal. The native community, the indigenous Jewish community of Portugal, which numbered between 25 and 35,000 Jews, and the additional 75,000 Jews that had come over from Spain. Now, he decided in the long run that he could not afford to lose 10% of his population. Let's remember that in 1497, there were only 1 million people in Portugal, and if he were to expel this approximately 100,000 Jews, he would lose a tenth of his population, and not only lose a tenth of his population, but he would also lose many of his tax farmers, people who collected his taxes, in other words, clerks, a lot of people that were in various economic and industrial sectors.
A lot of the middle class.
A lot of the then
filled up in Europe in the
right
in those times, yeah.
In the burgeoning middle class.
And it didn't make a difference to him. He still carried it through, even though he, like say, you cut off your nose to spite your face.
Well, that's the whole thing. You see, he decided it turned out that he was rather more clever than we would have thought at first, because he decided in the end not to expel them, but instead, in 1497, he carried out a forced mass conversion of all the Jews to Christianity, namely to Catholicism. So that is the big difference between Spain and Portugal here. In other words, or rather there are two differences. Number one, that in Spain there were two communities side by side. There was a new Christian community and or forced converts community on the one hand, and on the other hand there were Shlomei Emunei Yisrael, those who had continued on with their Judaism and had no connection whatsoever to Catholicism. And this was from 1391 all the way up to 1492. On the other hand, in Portugal we have only one kind of community. First we have a Jewish community, and then everyone is forcibly converted in 1497, and they all become, at least officially, Catholics. The other difference is that Spain was the pioneer in terms of establishing a national inquisition. National meaning that it was under the aegis of the king, and he gave it his patronage. Only later, only in 1539, as I said, the King of Portugal finally established an inquisition in Portugal. When in 1497 King Manuel had forced all the Jews to convert, he had given them 20 years to learn the tenets of Christianity, or Catholicism if you like, and that was extended up by various negotiations between the former Jews, now new Christians, and the papal nuncio in Portugal. And so therefore there was an enormous waiting period between the time that they were forcibly converted and the time that the first auto de fe, or ritual burning ceremony of heretics, took place in 1540.
Now, let's go back to numbers. So you're saying that there's 100,000 Jews in Portugal. How many would you say, or is there documented, that escaped? How many ran away, probably mainly to middle part of Europe or wherever? Maybe you can fill us in where people did escape to. Where did they go from Portugal? And how many Jews actually died throughout all these number of years of these inquisitions? And how many would you say just relented and just became, like you say, new Christians?
Well, I put it this way. First of all, in 1497, at the time of the forced mass conversion, it had originally been King Manuel's intention that all the Jews should go down to the area known as Rocio in Lisbon, which was and is still to today, the main square in downtown Lisbon. And then maybe I might want to point out to you it might be of some interest to the viewers, if I might. This is a picture here of the Lisbon Jewish Community Quarter in the from the late 15th century. And so he had intended that they should have not that they should have a mass conversion, but rather that they should all leave. He had promised them at first. He tricked them. He had intended to, supposedly, he had told the Jewish leaders, such as Rabbi Miami, who was the head of the Jewish community at that time in Lisbon, that they could all leave, and that he had arranged ships for them to leave at the harbor down below in the area which is today known as the Praça do Comércio, or the Royal Court area by the Royal Palace Plaza by the harbor, the what is known as the Terra do Passo, or the Palace Terrace, it's called in Portuguese. But he did not follow through with what he had told them. Instead, they were forced to convert. They were brought to a palace known as the Estões, which is by the harbor there, and many of them, thousands supposedly, were forcibly converted there. At that point, he then started to forcibly convert other Jews throughout the country in the various areas where there were Jews. Let's not forget that the Jews were located in many different places throughout Portugal, and not only that, it was the Jews who were the first to print books in Portugal. The first book that was printed in Lisbon in 1489 was the commentary of Nachmanides to the Hebrew Bible. And there were other Hebrew printing centers in Leiria, which is a town in central Portugal, and in the south of Portugal, in the province known as the Algarve, there was another Hebrew press in Faro, which is the main city there. I just want to mention one other thing when I'm talking about this this whole business of the Jewish community there, that there was also a substantial difference between the Spanish and the Portuguese Jewish communities, in that the chief rabbi in Portugal had much more power, had much more say than his opposite number in Spain. In other words, the Rab de la Corte in Spain was basically a court Jew. He was a Jewish courtier of the king, whereas in Lisbon, the Arabi Mor, or head rabbi or chief rabbi, was really a chief rabbi, and he went around from place to place, and he supervised the local rabbis. The local rabbi in Lisbon, the main synagogue was down in that same area of the Praça do Comércio, just across the street from where is now the Lisbon Stock Exchange. And he went from place to place, and he supervised the work of his other rabbis there in Portugal. Now, as I mentioned previously, once they had all been forcibly converted, the Jews were given a 20-year period to learn the tenets of Catholicism from 1497 on, in other words, till 1517, so to speak. Now, already in 1506, there were mass riots against the New Christians in Lisbon. For example, there were mass riots around the church of São Domingos, St. Dominic's Church in Lisbon, when New Christians who were there had laughed at what we call old Christians. In other words, people who had originally been Christians and had been Christians throughout, considered to have been a holy apparition of the image of Mary. but they had laughed at this, and this had caused massive riots in Lisbon. These riots then went all the way up to another main town outside of Lisbon known as Santarém, where the king had one of his palaces. The king sent down reinforcements to Lisbon to quell the disturbances, but the net result of these mass riots was to create a impetus for the new Christians to leave Portugal and to go abroad. And that's exactly what happened. In other words, from 1506, we have mass emigrations of new Christians who managed one way or another. Because of their Christian status, they were able to leave the country relatively easily at that time, and to go to the south of France. It's from this time that we begin to have new Christian communities in such places as Bayonne and Bordeaux. We get the beginnings of Jewish communities also in Belgium and Holland, specifically in Antwerp and Amsterdam, and throughout the rest of Western Europe. In addition, at the time of the Spanish expulsion in 1492, already there was an Eastern movement to the Eastern Mediterranean. We only have to look at Yitaka Bravanel, Don Yitaka Bravanel, who sailed with his family and went to Italy. Others ended up in Greece and finally in Turkey. I can mention to you, for example, the family of Don Joseph Nassi and Dona Graça Nassi, who had the famous Mendes Bank, merchant bank in Lisbon. They went to Ferrara in Italy and eventually ended up, specifically Don Joseph Nassi, as an advisor to the Turkish Sultan in Istanbul, and was made himself a duke, the Duke of Naxos. He had his own islands in the Aegean Sea that he was lord of, although he never visited them, and he had intended to reestablish a Jewish community in Tiberias. Unfortunately, this project did not succeed. There were also other Jews, Sephardic Jews, in other words, Sephardic, I mean from Spain, who had been expelled in 1492, that eventually ended up in Sfat, in Safed, in the north of the land of Israel, where they practiced Lurianic Kabbalah, for example, Jewish mysticism. That it became a very important center for the study of Torah. In addition, you wanted also for me to tell you a little bit about the numbers who were burned.
Right.
Yeah. Actually, when you talk about the Inquisition, you cannot possibly compare it to the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews in our own time. There is absolutely no comparison. When we're talking about, say, nearly 6 million people, between 5 and 6 million people who were killed by the Nazis, deliberately exterminated by them during the Second World War, when you're talking about the Inquisition, you're talking about 2,000 people who lost their lives. But that's not the whole story. Let us not forget that there were tens of thousands of others whose lives were disrupted, who lost all their possessions, whose families were torn apart as they were imprisoned and tried by the Inquisition, whether it be in Spain or Portugal. And many of them ended up finally dying in prison or dying in exile or having to spend decades in monasteries doing penitence. So the whole story is not told by those numbers that were burned at the stake.
So did you go back, when you went to Portugal to look into your thesis, did you find any of the remnants? Now you're talking 500 years ago, that's a tremendous amount of time to find the remnants of underground Jewish people, but did you find any today that there are from people like this?
Absolutely. And I found it really amazing that they still exist. There's a village in the north of Portugal, in the northeastern part of Portugal, which is known as Belmonte. It's near a major center known as Guarda, where there had been a very substantial Jewish community in medieval Portugal prior to 1497. And they are still there. I mean, these crypto-Jews, they still live there. Now they're even much, their practice is far more open. They're going to establish a synagogue there now. There's a rabbi from Jerusalem, from the Rabbi Cook Institute in Jerusalem, Rabbi Sabag, who is going to convert them. They will have Giur. And it is hoped that they will eventually have all of the appurtenances of Judaism, kosher food and whatever, a mikveh. And I think that
they kept themselves aware of their Judaism for 500 years, even though outwardly they were acting as Christians.
Well, they kept various Judaizing practices. In other words, some of these have been very well documented by the late Anglo-Jewish historians, Professor Cecil Roth of Oxford University, who described some of these things in one of his books, The History of Marranos, and also they were also described by a Polish Jewish engineer by the name of Schwartz, who visited Portugal after World War I, and he went to this village and other villages in the area, and they couldn't believe, they didn't realize that there were other Jews in the world. They thought that they were the remaining, that they were the She'erit Yisrael, the remnant of Israel, and the only remnant of Israel. But only when he started to say the Shema, the Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad, then they knew that he was one of them, and that and they were just dumbfounded by this. This was like a complete revelation for them. And he documents in a book that he published as well on how, for example, they would light Shabbat candles, they would put them in jugs, the candles, and hide them under a table so that their Gentile neighbors wouldn't see the glow from the candlelight on Friday nights. That's one example of their Judaizing. And of course, they completely abstained from eating pork. They would wear clean clothes on Shabbat, and they would wash before Shabbat. These, by the way, were some of the reasons to condemn these people when they appeared before the Inquisition on trial. So that, yes, they are there. I personally visited them in the fall of 1984 with the delegations of young people from the Lisbon Jewish community and various different communities from throughout Spain who came especially to meet them at that time.
Well, very good. And in conclusion, it was very interesting, and really I'm sure that we could have more time, we could talk more about this very interesting subject in Jewish history, and of course, like I introduced it, that people know, especially in America now, 1492 is such a special date, and really in American history, and every school-age child knows this, but really for the Jewish history, of course, it's just a major, maybe it's an unfortunate mark, but it's something to be remembered about the Spanish Inquisition. Together also, it's just the Portuguese Inquisition. It's something that is interesting in Jewish viewpoint. It's the roots of many of the modern-day Jewish communities, like you see in Israel and then maybe in Middle Europe and the Eastern Europe, really stem from this portion, and then really I think American Jews get their history from it, so it's the history of their history. And of course, we have to remember over here that it's not easy for a Jew wherever they are, but it's interesting that Jewish people remain Jewish through 500 years under such circumstances. Maybe it's a good lesson for us that we have a little easier circumstances, to say the least. It behooves us to be good Jewish people. I want to thank you, Mr. Lorence, for coming on our show and informing our viewers about this interesting subject, and maybe another chance we'll get to talk a little more in depth. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Delmar Chabad Center, and today we have a special article that we're going to read, and it's a dialogue that's talking about Torah and worldly values. Synthesis or a conflict? I picked this article because it's such a well-expected topic amongst many people, because many people feel that being a Jewish person and being a worldly person are antithetical of each other. But now we're going to have a moderator talk to two special professors and dealing with this issue. Several years ago, I attended a Shabbaton, that's like a Shabbos afternoon session, on art, literature, and music, and Hasidic thought. The program was of interest to many people for whom these values were important. They were people with artistic vocation or a vocation or interest in literature, music, or other elements of secular culture. These were important components of their lives, and they were wondering to themselves, what does any of this have to do with Judaism? I am interested in Judaism. I feel attracted to authentic Judaism, Torah, but I feel that if I allow myself to be drawn to it, then I have to abandon all these other things because they have no place in it. I'm also very interested in my career. I'm afraid that if I follow my intuitive attraction to Judaism, I'm going to have to choose between all these things on the one hand and Judaism on the other. This is a very real concern of many people approaching Judaism, and one that we will attempt to address now. Baruch Bush served as moderator. He is professor of law at Hofstra University, and Alter Ben Zion Metzger is professor of Judaic Studies at Stern College, Yeshiva University, and Louis Frank is a mathematical physicist and the president of a data processing consulting firm. We'll call them, when they talk about the dialogue, Bush, Metzger, and Frank. Bush. Is it true that in order to lead a fully Jewish life, you must abandon your relationship with secular culture? Or perhaps you do not have to give it up, but if you don't and you cling to it instead of throwing yourself body and soul into becoming a Torah scholar, then you may never really be anything more than a kind of second-class citizen in a Torah-oriented community, where the heart of Jewish life is only occupation with Torah, and anything else is peripheral. Metzger. In my work with college students, I have recently observed that there are individuals who feel apprehensive about Judaism because they perceive it as a threat to their personal identity. These individuals with a particular frame of reference are drawn to Judaism, but at the same time feel that they're going to have to amputate or sever an aspect of their identity. I think that, on the contrary, a person should realize that he can serve God in all ways. If he had this artistic or intellectual baggage, then it can be used for the service of the Almighty. Frank, I agree. There is a certain element of divine providence and involvement in worldly things. Now, this is most clearly carried out if somebody has already been involved in secular studies before coming to Judaism. The idea that since somebody has had this background, as involved in a particular field, there is reason to pursue it. In true science, for example, there is also revelation of godliness. And there is divine providence there, that the natural order should be explicated and worked out through people who have a true Torah perspective. That may be the case to some extent in other fields as well. Certainly in the conceptualist or philosophical explanation of history, these things play some role. Bush, you're saying that somebody who is involved in some discipline is there for a reason, maybe to refine a particular part of the world? Is this idea unique to the Hasidic approach? Metzger. A primary concept of Hasidus is God omnipresence, and that God can be served in many ways. You find the famous stories about when the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidus, was praying once with great difficulty, and an illiterate shepherd boy came into the shul, not knowing the prayers, cried out, "Cock-a-doodle-doo." The Baal Shem Tov then began praying very joyously. He said later that his prayers were not accepted on high until this shepherd, using whatever talents he had in the service of God, made his heartfelt sounds. So since we have the concept of omnipresence, and Hashem affected his will through nature in its totality, then the beauty of nature or the beauty that man can create is something very important. And somebody who has a unique musical skill, acting skill, or whatever, can certainly use it in the service of Hashem. Bush. So if this is true, if there is something substantive in the secular or artistic field, then that makes involvement inappropriate from a form of a Hasidic perspective? That's good. The answer is emphatically yes. For example, we're seeing an incredible explosion of literature, and there's a lot of creativity that has already been dedicated to Judaism. Many people can use their skills and talents to create, and this way they will enrich their lives. Certainly they don't have to amputate a part of themselves. Bush. Let me push you a little bit further to use your analogy of amputation. You say it's permissible to find ways of using these things for the service of the Almighty. But would the approach go even further in saying that you shouldn't amputate at all? That if you had this background, that amputating would be counterproductive? Metzger. An essential response is contained in two words: Judaism of repression and Judaism of expression. Without being too simplistic, I would say that in terms of Hasidus, the emphasis is upon expression. A person who has literary skills, for example, can use them in illuminating personality, themes, concepts, and so on. There are many, many aspects of Jewish history which would lend themselves to incredible literary dramatization, being both meaningful and provocative. So in the process of transition, the individual will often be able to be expressive if he or she finds the right social milieu. True, elements of repression are necessary when the literature is in conflict with Jewish moral values. Boy, there are a number of questions that occur to me, and I'm not sure what the logical order is, but let's pursue this in terms of self-image. The individual who doesn't amputate his or her previous involvements. Does this person nevertheless always feel, in spite of the justifications, the reasons, the divine providence that being involved in other areas instead of being fully devoted to Torah learning and not having had an opportunity to do so earlier in life, that somehow he or she always remains on the periphery of Jewish life? In other words, is that a marginal existence, or is there something Hasidic that says, no, that's also a primary Jewish existence? Frank. Ideally, the way one should look at oneself is that relationship to God is the primary value. Now, there can be a whole spectrum of modalities in which a relationship to God can take place, of which Torah is ideologically highest, and all these other levels can be put in that context. You have not missed a boat just because you have some relationship to some of these other things. But one thing has to be kept in mind, and I think it goes a long way to explain that seemingly totally negative positions that people talk about involvement in secular endeavors, is that there are very real inherent dangers. This may sound rather elitist, but I think it's very simply true. It is very difficult for people to preserve the balance between these various elements in their lives, and it's much simpler to tell people Torah study is the primary and only value. And just pursue that. Just measure yourself in that very simplistic dimension. The simplistic dimension is not false, but it just isn't the whole story. Metzger. I think we're talking about two different populations. The population that is rooted and grew up in Judaism, and the population that is basically new to it. Going back to the self-concept of the individual, I remember once hearing two different definitions of psychology. One was that the function of psychology is to enhance the self-concept, and the other that it was to heighten frustration toleration. This tension is very significant in the transition process, and in many instances it's a function of the community that he's relating to, and of the individual as well. In the transition of the self-concept, it is very important for the person to have a sense of self-esteem. It's also very important to choose a community that will view him in a positive light. If he tries to get involved in a situation where the idealized image is very much at variance from his present reality, and he is locking himself into a Pavlovian situation of self-induced neurosis. Bush. Are you suggesting that if someone coming to Judaism at a later stage in life, not being ready to become a full-time Torah scholar, finds himself going towards a community where that's the only value, he's creating tremendous problems for himself? That's good. Yes, for someone who knows very little about Judaism, This ideological, intellectual, and cultural transition must be a gradual one. If it's going to be abrupt, if the individual is going to tear himself or herself from the roots trying to surge forward too quickly, then it is almost programmed for self-frustration. Bush. I have a sense, based upon students that I encounter who are first introduced to a religious point of view that is non-Hasidic, that the attitude toward these things we're talking about is very different from the attitude that I encountered, that other people encounter when they come in contact with Chabad. Is that true? Are there differences in this between Hasidic Judaism and non-Hasidic Judaism? Frank, I think it's clear that there are differences. The differences are undoubtedly of emphasis rather than of absolutes. Everything requires a certain balance. But in terms of how the pieces are put together, the typical non-Hasidic yeshiva perspective puts a primacy on intellectual endeavors in Torah that is so far above everything else that almost everything else just disappears. That is not the Hasidic value in the Hasidic perspective. The Hasidic perspective places a great deal of emphasis on the emotional and many other facets. So there is certainly more in terms of balance. I guess that's part of the reason why I'm here and not somewhere else, because I've more or less been exposed to both strains of Judaism. I've gone to non-Hasidic yeshivas as well. There's a certain single focus, a focus which perhaps is very beneficial in terms of the intellectual progress that one can make, but it really cuts them off from much else that's in their lives and is very limited. And that is not the case in the Hasidic perspective. There's a much holistic ability to integrate all of life's experiences into what one's relationship to God is. And I think that it's much healthier in a certain sense because it does enable the person to preserve a certain balance. And I'm not talking about the Baal Tshuva. I'm talking about the ideal way people should be, having an ability to integrate all experience. There's another point which is perhaps the most important, although I don't know if it particularly addresses what we're discussing. When you study Hasidus, you are studying the relationship to God in a very direct way. They just unfortunately do not have that in the non-Hasidic tradition. Even in the Musar ethical approach, it does not exist at the same level. Musar is involved with personality traits and fashioning your midos, character traits, which is certainly in Hasidus as well. But a direct involvement in what you might call metaphysical speculation, what our relationship with God is, just doesn't exist elsewhere. You're supposed to get it somehow by osmosis in non-Hasidic approaches, but in Hasidism, you're involved. Every aspect of the human being has to be involved. One is involved intellectually in terms of the actual Torah study. One is also involved spiritually, practically, and emotionally. Is a much more holistic approach. Bush. Now, so according to Hasidism, it seems clear that one who is not a Torah scholar is not relegated to a marginal existence in Judaism. This seems to be part of the whole historical phenomena of Hasidism. But so far we have been talking about the tension between other intellectual occupations and Torah. Now, Torah certainly is not just an intellectual occupation. It takes time. It's a physical occupation as well. And someone who has to go to work every day just doesn't have as much time for Torah study. So what about a merchant or businessman? Is that person a second-class citizen in the Torah world? Metzger. The axiological perception of identity in the Hasidic world is not solely in terms of scholarly accomplishment. Indeed, we find throughout the history of Hasidus that the simple faith of a Jew who is not very scholarly could be considered superior to another person's intellectual accomplishment. A person might be accorded great esteem because he is perceived as an oved, one who labors to serve God, striving to serve God to the best of his ability. Another person may be more intellectually accomplished, but it's felt that somehow in his personal religious life there's a good deal left to be accomplished. The essence of the Hasidus is relationship. What you mean by the essence is relational is that the point is not the learning, the point is the relationship. That's good. The point is that through my learning and through all my occupation I relate to God, and if I forget about that, then I'm not fulfilling the real purpose. Okay, going back to your question about the individual who is not inclined to scholarship, it is interesting that the highest form of praise around here, the Hasidic community, is that someone is a Hasidic Yid, and not that he's a scholar. What's the significance of that distinction? A Hasidic Yid is not necessarily someone of great scholarly accomplishments. It's someone who is, in terms of warmth, in terms of relationship to God, in terms of relationship to his peers, exemplifies the spirit of what Hasidus is supposed to be about, of what Torah scholarship is certainly a part, but is certainly not the sole part, perhaps not even the main part. Bush. The integration that you describe is welcome on the one hand, because it doesn't ask someone to amputate this or that. On the other hand, it's rather demanding. It's not simply asking to do a certain amount, to learn for a certain number of hours and a certain number of pages, and then go to work and do whatever you have to do to support your family.